Okay, we are live. So welcome to Ask Cam, and we are talking today about universal credit. Now, it's a topic that comes up quite a lot. As citizens of Ice Manchester, I don't think anybody would be particularly surprised. And we have done a couple of different live streams about universal credit over the last few months, particularly around the Keep the Lifeline campaign, which unfortunately, obviously, the £20 uplift has been cut now, and we will be seeing people who are on a lower level of universal credit. But what we really wanted to cover today was the fact that what we're starting to see is some people having issues with their universal credit award and potentially not recognising that they've got an issue until they end up calling us about something else. So I am joined by the lovely Tom and Asia, who are from our advice line and our welfare benefits teams. So thank you all for being here today. And we're going to essentially just dive in with a conversation about sort of what some of those issues are and how you might recognise your own universal credit award. As always, we will be taking questions live. So if you do have a question about universal credit, about your universal credit award, please feel free to drop it into the comments or the chat box. And we will do our best to answer your questions here, or at least route you into the advice that you might need. So, first and foremost, can you recap for me, folks, about what universal credit is and which benefits it took over from? Because it's essentially coming in place of other benefits, hasn't it? So, Tom Spillane.
So universal credit essentially is a benefit that's taken over the likes of housing benefit for your housing costs, tax credits for the running costs for your children. There's lots of different elements built within universal credit to replace the different benefits that were called legacy benefits that were being paid on different days. And so I suppose the overall idea is it's all under one roof. It's trying to simplify things in a sense, so everything's paid on the one day. It can help with bills, and you're not dealing with different entities, i.e. housing benefit was with the council. Tax credits, HMRC, so everything's paid under the one banner of the DWP. I suppose the overall ideology behind it is that any questions you can report through the Universal Credit Journal under the one roof instead of having to contact the council if it was housing benefit. Like I said, HMRC, if it was tax credits, etc. It's also replaced ESA. Or income-related ESA, not contribution-based. Which is with the DWP. But I suppose there's different elements. Like you've got your limited capability for work element, which would replace the sort of support group with the income-related ESA. So I suppose all in all, it's to get it under the one banner, and to simplify things on that, on that side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Tom. That's really sort of comprehensive. Now, we know that obviously that came in a good number of years ago now, so probably, and really started to roll out in force even right back in sort of 2016. But obviously there have been various changes along the way as sort of universal credit gets a little bit tweaked to match people's circumstances. And obviously what we saw through the pandemic was there was an increase made to universal credit for some people of £20 a week to sort of get them through the difficulties that the pandemic brought. The government have chosen now to cut that uplift, despite our campaigning that really did need to be in place permanently. But there's in sort of the more positive side of things have started to change a little bit or will be changing sort of coming up, won't they, with universal credit in terms of what I'm going to call it a taper, as I know that that's our language, but I know that also that probably doesn't mean a huge amount to people who are necessarily on universal credit. So other Tom, for want of a better term, can you talk to us a little bit about what the changes coming up are going to be?
Right. So yeah, I think it's worth giving a sort of an overview of how universal credit payments are put together and how they fit together to sort of explain that in context. So basically, universal credit is one monthly payment, as Tom said. So everybody, if you're entitled to universal credit in the first place, you'll get what's called a standard allowance, which is basically a set amount, and how much you get as your standard allowance depends on whether you're claiming as a single person or a couple. And whether one of you is over 25 or not. Basically, the amount is more for the standard allowance if you're a couple, and it's more if one of you is over 25. So what you basically do then is you look at whether there are any other elements on universal credit that you could be entitled to. So those are extra bits to reflect your different circumstances. There is a housing element, which you can get to help with your housing costs in rent and accommodation. There is a limited capability for work and work-related activity element if you're assessed as having limited capability for work and work-related activity. There is a child element if you're looking after children. There's a carer element if you're a carer, and there's a disabled child element if you're looking after children. So the first step is to add together all of the elements that you could be entitled to on universal credit. And if you do need help with that, you can get in touch with a benefits advisor. The next step is to make a reduction based on how much earnings you have coming in or how much capital you have, and that's sort of where the change has been made. First of all, it's worth just briefly explaining that if you are looking after children, or if you've been assessed as having limited capability for work, then you have what's called a work allowance, which is an amount that you can earn up to before any earnings start to affect your universal credit. Currently, either if you've got no work allowance or over that work allowance, then for every pound that you earn, 63 pence is deducted from your universal credit. So it's 63% of what you earn is taken from your universal credit. The change that they've proposed, and that's going to happen, is that they're reducing that taper down to 55%. So for every pound that you earn, either over your work allowance, or if there's no work allowance, then just every pound you earn, 55 pence will be deducted from your universal credit from your earnings. Things work slightly different with other sources of income, but yes, that's sort of the gist of it.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's really good and really clear. So essentially what it means is that you will be able to sort of earn a little bit more and have a bit more sort of universal credit as a top up, then rather than sort of kind of, I guess, like losing out because you're choosing to work more. Like it's not those two things.
Exactly. Or even of what you earn, even if your earnings stay the same, a lower percentage of that will be deducted from your universal credit. So it will be an increase. It might not make up for the full £20 a week cut, but it will be an increase in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that's a clear sort of point is and something that I sort of hadn't touched on. So thank you for picking it up. Was that it won't for everybody. It won't necessarily make the difference, but it will at least sort of go some way towards helping. So obviously we've touched a little bit on the different elements there of universal credit and kind of and what they look like. Asia, if someone is, say, getting universal credit and they have got maybe different parts of elements, so they might have what used to be a job seeker's allowance and then they've got their housing allowance as well, do those show up separately for people in their statement, or do they essentially just get like one lump payment that they can see?
Well, what happens is normally 3 days before you receive your universal credit payment, a statement should come in through the post. For some people it is online, for some people it is through the sort of the post. If you maintain your universal credit claim through the phone, it'll always be paper-based. And on that universal credit statement, it should give you the full amount of universal credit you're receiving, say £1,000. Then it should break that up into the various elements as well. So it should break it down into the housing element if you're renting, or if you have a social home through the council, and it should sort of say if you get any child element or a standard adult element, it's sometimes referred to, or a couple element if you're in a couple. It should break it down into the amount that you are receiving in each one. And then it should as well, if there's any deductions being made from it, say you've had an advanced payment in the past because you were struggling before your universal credit claim went through, or if you've struggled with debts before with the DWP, or you're being sanctioned, they should also come up as a breakdown on your universal credit statement. If you go into your online journal or your statements, it should all be available on there. You can also ask your work coach or the job centre if they can sort of give you a breakdown if you're not too sure of your breakdown is, because it can be difficult to find. That's one of the sort of things that we see sort of comes through an advice line or help to claim, is the statement is there, but because there's so many sort of different things to read and different things on the statements, that it can be difficult to find. It's normally sort of at the top of the statement, so it should be available.
Yeah, that's really good, because I know that sort of one of the issues that someone sort of mentioned to me is that actually sometimes people are being sort of, part of their award has been calculated incorrectly, and that might be the housing element part, and that previously, obviously, if you claimed housing benefit, you would get your housing benefit award, and you would look and quite clearly say, that's not going to cover my rent, so I know that something's wrong there, or I'm concerned, and you would make a call. Whereas if things are sort of lumped in under universal credit, it's not always that clear. So are we seeing sort of a few people starting to come through with issues like that?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the time we get people come through who sort of say, I received this on ESA and it's not come through to my universal credit, or I don't know how much I'm receiving on universal credit, and this is how much I was receiving before. Or say if somebody had sort of a health condition or disability that severely impacted their ability to work, that sometimes doesn't get carried over to universal credit when it should. That's one of the key sort of things that we see in advice line, where they're like, I've asked the DWP to explain this again and again, and they're sort of not giving me a satisfactory response. But definitely on advice line, we can break down each element that you should be receiving and the amount that you should be receiving, and if there's any issues or if you're in the wrong group, it's definitely something we can help to inquire the DWP about.
Great, that's really good to know. I think that is something that we should point out. Essentially, if you are having any issues with your universal credit award, we know that unfortunately for some people, universal credit just isn't enough for them to get by on at the moment. And obviously we want to continue our our research and campaigns work on continuing to make universal credit a system that's fit for purpose. But sort of aside from that, we know that equally some people aren't getting enough, and they're not getting what they're entitled to because something's gone wrong in that calculation. So if you are concerned and you don't think you're getting enough in your universal credit award, do give us a call. We can't guarantee that we're necessarily going to be able to make it more, but it's absolutely worth checking out. And I will pop up our advice line number on the bottom of the screen there, so that if anybody does want to sort of take our details, then you absolutely can. And as I said, please do keep those questions and comments coming in if you are concerned about your universal credit award at all. So aside from potentially sort of not seeing the different elements of their universal credit award, what are some of the common issues that we're seeing? I'm going to ask Tom number one, Tom below me.
Yeah. I see, just from general experience, I do work on the advice line team and the welfare benefits team. So I kind of split, and I know Tom himself has worked on sort of advice line as well. So we all have the full context of everything. But it's kind of the earning amounts and the reported earnings of HMRC that affecting people's universal credit awards incorrectly. I experience a lot of these calls, and it's one of the first things that springs to mind. It may be a case that somebody hasn't, let's say somebody normally works a set amount of hours each month. They've worked less than that for this month. So let's say 40 hours per week, but they, for whatever reason in the personal life, or there may be just reduced hours on the work contract, they're earning less from work that month. Reflected in their universal credit payment is still at the 40 hours. So effectively, they're not earning the 40 hours from work, and they're not getting the correct universal credit amount. When they go to challenge this with universal credit, they normally receive an instant reply to say, well, you need to prove it to us. So it'll be a case, from my experience with this, it will just be a case of getting the wage slips, getting your bank statements, anything to prove at all that what was paid into your bank was not the equivalent of 40 hours worth of work. Just to use an example, and kind of send that through to universal credit via a mandatory reconsideration. Before doing so, it is worth, before going down the official route, so just to sort of clarify, a mandatory mandatory reconsideration is to challenge the DWP's decision on any matter, whether it be, and that's across all benefits. But before going through with a mandatory reconsideration, it may be worth just having a conversation on the phone to see if that can be resolved, sort of straight away. But in most cases, they will ask you to submit a formal challenge to that, and that we can help with that. So it may be worth giving us a call. We can help you type that out, advise you on what to put in on different instances. I'm just using that as an example, but certainly the incorrect earnings being reported having an effect on a payment is something we do experience a lot, but I must say can in most cases be resolved. So it's just the case of not panicking, sort of using the correct evidence, such as wage slips, bank statements, or of course you can give us a call as well on our advice line for more information on that.
Thanks, Tom. Other Tom, what about you in the sort of welfare benefits team? Are there any other issues that you're sort of starting to see come through more frequently?
I wouldn't say that I've noticed a diachronic change. I wouldn't say I've noticed a big change over time of the types of inquiry that we get. But I think still the most common that I would say I see is issues just where there's been a miscommunication or information hasn't been taken down in terms of which elements the client might be eligible for. So, for instance, a client may have reported that they aren't able to work due to ill health or a disability. In principle, Universal Credit are supposed to perform a work capability assessment to check your capability for work within 3 months of when you first submit a fit note on Universal Credit to tell them that you're not able to, that you have limited capability for work. For that reason, just as an aside, it is worth getting a fit note from your doctor or from a clinician treating you and submitting that to the Department for Work and Pensions to let them know if you're not able to work due to ill health or a disability. There may be situations where that information hasn't been taken down, and the client may need to sort of expedite that. A client may, so for example, a carer element you can be entitled to if you provide care for 35 hours per week to somebody who's in receipt of a number of disability benefits. So for example, personal independence payment or attendance allowance, etc. And essentially the DWP may not be aware that or may not have noted that the client is providing that level of care, and they may not have added the element. To sort of cut my answer a little bit short without going too much into detail, but we see a lot around the housing element as well. So the housing element for Universal Credit is based on your circumstances. In social housing, it will generally be up to 100% of your rent. It can depend on whether your service charges are eligible. Any service charges that you have. It can also depend on whether you have any non-dependents living with you, so any adults or people who aren't dependents of you who are living in the household with you. There can be a deduction made to your housing element for that. You can also have what's commonly referred to as the bedroom tax. I believe it's officially known as the removal of the spare room subsidy. But essentially, they can make a deduction if you are assumed or taken to have more bedrooms than you need. Now, there's a couple of different issues that can come up around that about, for example, with non-dependents, maybe the non-dependent has left, maybe the non-dependent is for some reason exempt from being classed as a non-dependent. And similarly with the spare room subsidy, it is sometimes possible to make an argument that bedroom's needed for various reasons. I think that's one way it'd be best to get in touch with your advisor. Again, as a slight aside, and not to get too far off topic, but if you are having a deduction made and it's correct, you may be able to apply for something called a discretionary housing payment from the council to cover the shortfall. I'll let that come up organically if it does come up again.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. Very comprehensive. I think, and that's it, as you say, that sort of all of these different elements and moving parts to Universal Credit that do kind of sometimes make it a bit complicated to sort of pick up on where something's going wrong. Atia, in your experience, and as I know as sort of probably a slightly newer member of our team, are there issues that you're seeing that sort of don't necessarily cover the things that Tom have mentioned, but that you've seen come through with Universal Credit?
Yeah, I mean, when I first sort of joined Advice Line about 6 months ago, I was actually surprised because I thought universal credit was really sort of simple, straightforward, and sort of lo and behold, it's definitely sometimes can be quite difficult. A lot of the issues I'm seeing are sort of similar to what the Toms have said in terms of the employment issues and sort of the housing element issues. I think one of the most common ones that we definitely see is sort of the bedroom tax being applied when it shouldn't be applied, especially because there's some differences between housing benefit and housing element of universal credit, and a lot of the rules have changed under the housing element. For example, with housing benefit, you were sometimes entitled to an extra bedroom if you sort of had, had sort of a health condition that meant you needed like extra space, like a wheelchair or any sort of aids, auxiliary aids. Whereas that's sort of changed under the housing element. They're sort of a little bit less generous there. In some circumstances, housing element can be slightly more generous than the housing benefit, but I think the other ones that we mainly see are sort of people not being referred for a work capability assessment when they should be within the 3-month deadline. When someone's sort of terminally ill, they should be sort of referred to that work capability assessment on the first day of their claim. And they're not they're the main sort of issues I think we see in terms of housing, employment, and then people, unfortunately, with disabilities or health conditions who aren't sort of treated with the principles that universal credit sets out that they should be.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately, like as you say, there are sort of a lot of people falling through the net, and some of those particularly vulnerable sort of people, as you say, with sort of terminal illness or not getting picked up as they should be sort of really early on. So some of these areas, and I know that, so sometimes it will be a case that somebody does look at their Universal Credit Award, go, that doesn't feel great, I don't really like that, and will give us a call, and that's directly what somebody calls us about. However, I know that some of these issues are actually getting picked up almost as part of something else. How often do we sort of people call directly, and how often do you think we sort of notice those actually when someone calls about a different issue?
I would say it's kind of hard to put a sort of percentage on it, I'd say, but it is a kind of a mixture. In some instances, it may be that somebody has failed a work capability assessment and disagrees with the decision, let's say. So that obviously that's calling directly about it. So we'd obviously advise on how to challenge that. But there is many instances where somebody may call up about PIP. And let's say they need help with a PIP form, which is obviously directly related to how your health affects you in daily life. So that could imply that somebody may be entitled to, limited capability for work and work-related activity, whereas they may just be getting the standard allowance. So when you kind of delve into their situation a bit more, or the client's situation, it may become apparent that maybe they should be applying for that, and there could be an additional amount of universal credit that they could get based on their situation. I mean, it's not always the case, because they may be actively looking for work, but we do on many occasions inform the client of this through another issue, if that makes sense. So the best advice I could say is what Tom alluded to earlier on in the conversation. Everybody gets their standard allowance, so it'd be worth checking the other additional elements to see, am I entitled to any of them? Do any of them apply to me? So if you feel that your universal credit is round about, the standard allowance, whether you're over or under 25, and that's all you're getting, and you've got children, housing costs, disabilities, whatever the case may be, it may just be worth checking the additional elements to see, am I entitled to anything, and go from there.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So even though we did kind of cover them briefly or in their various little bits and pieces, the thing, as you say, there's the sort of the standard allowance, if you like, and standard allowance, I guess, is correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am, but standard allowance is almost like the equivalent of if you were going to apply for job seekers allowance. That's why you've maybe gone to claim for universal credit. Is that right?
Yeah, it'd be fair to say. So it's basically the minimum you will get as a starting point on universal credit. Obviously, that doesn't take into account, you may get a deductions for an advance payment, or maybe maybe a debt that you're paying back to the DWP. But let's just kind of put that aside for now. Not taking into account housing costs, children, health conditions, that's your standard amount. If you're fit and able and looking for work, you know, you don't have any children or housing costs, that's the amount that you will get. And obviously that rate will vary whether you're over 25 in a couple or single and under 25. So yeah, just to go back to it, it's worth checking, going through the different elements, which is quite clear, I feel, on the gov.uk website. You know, it explains each element and what that entails, how much it will be, and what the eligibility criteria is. So check that, and if you feel you may be entitled to something, let Universal Credit know as soon as you can. Great. And they can recalculate the claim. Yeah.
Wonderful. And as you say, like on the gov.uk website, that it is all laid out there. But I realised that actually what I made was a massive error there, in the sense that I alluded to it being equivalent to job seekers allowance, and obviously universal credit pays for people who are already in work and on a low income, isn't it? So it's actually it's much more connected to how much money you have coming in,
absolutely,
work or not, and that it's very important that, you know, this isn't just about people who are out of work. It is about people who are at any kind of circumstances where their income is just a little bit low and needs something.
It might be you know, single parent with children and housing costs who may work, you know, in some cases a full-time job, and the rent is high. They've got you know, children to pay for. So when the claim is calculated on the whole, and there still may be an entitlement of universal credit as well. So yeah, that's correct. It's not necessarily just for people out of work.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Tom. Like I say, that was my error by the way that I phrased the question. So, but that's so essentially, your standard allowance, and then you're talking about additional things. So if you have children, if you have a disability or health condition, if you have a need for your housing costs being paid, like, are those sort of the top three things that people might need in terms of like things that might be missing from their award, if they have like things that might not have been considered?
There's the carers element as well. So as if you provide 35 hours a week of care for somebody who gets a disability benefit, or if you have a severely disabled child, you can get an element for that as well.
Great. That's really good to know. There you go. I was just thinking, I'm sure there's another one that I've just missed. But that's good to know. So again, if any of those things sort of apply to you and you're sort of thinking, I don't think this doesn't look like it's the right amount. So obviously we've talked about the fact that on the gov.uk website, there are lists of like the different elements out there. How else could people sort of check? How can they check their decision if they think it might be incorrect?
I think one of the key sort of things they could use is sort of the local housing allowance calculator. It's just sort of, you just type in local housing allowance calculator. It's usually the first link on the sort of the web page is there, and it'll give you sort of a rough. Well, sometimes you put your postcode in, a pretty accurate sort of amount for how much you should be receiving in rent costs, because a lot of the time we sort of see people's housing costs are reduced when they really shouldn't be, or if someone's had an increase in rent and the landlord sort of, you know, increased the rent, and they've sort of been sensible and let the DWP know, the DWP will sometimes put a reduction on the rent like housing costs when there shouldn't be a reduction put in there, because it still falls into sort of their local housing allowance. I know there's a lot of words going on sort of there, but local housing allowance is just pretty much how much money Universal Credit are willing to pay your housing. If your housing is above that and there's a shortfall, like Tom alluded to, you can apply for something else with the council. If your rent is less than that, then they'll pay the lower amount. But if your rent increases and there's been, you know, an unfair reduction put on there, definitely sort of, if you think that applies, check it on the local housing allowance calculator, because that'll give you an idea of how much they should be paying you for your housing.
That's great. And of course, we should say that, you know, you can contact us as well if you think that perhaps your award isn't correct. And obviously what we have talked about sort of in terms of like checking the local housing allowance calculator, going on the gov.uk website, that is making a presumption that people are online, and obviously people who are watching here are obviously online in some format, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're sort of necessarily feeling completely able to go and check those websites. We know that like digital technology is quite complicated for a lot of people, and particularly sometimes things around universal credit. So if someone doesn't feel confident to look on the government websites, things like that. So they can give us a call. Is there anywhere else that they can go? Can they just call their Universal Credit work coach, or?
Yeah, so if they're not sure how much is in their award and they can't access their Universal Credit Journal, they could call their work coach in the first instance. So that is the name of essentially I'm trying to find the right word actually, the operative at the DWP with whom they'll sort of interact, and so they could call their work coach, or there is actually a helpline called the Universal Credit Helpline that they may be able to ring if they're having problems with their Universal Credit claim, and they're not sure who to speak to about it, or if they would like to check as well what their award actually is in the first instance, and they don't have access to the internet.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Tom. What I'll do as well while we're on the subject of calling us, I will pop up our number again just there. So again, if you do want to get in touch with us, then that's our phone number, or you can visit, again, this, depending on whether you feel confident using websites, that's our website address, and there are different ways of getting in touch with us. So for example, through Facebook Messenger, or using WhatsApp as well. So if you want to kind of explore the different ways that you might be able to get in touch with us, as we know sometimes the telephone isn't great for everybody either. So say somebody checks their allowance and they feel that maybe something isn't right there and they want to challenge it. I know sort of, Tom, you've already talked a little bit about mandatory reconsiderations and sort of discussions like that, but what might be the steps that people need to follow?
Yeah, so you can ultimately, if you disagree with a decision with the DWP on the whole, speaking sort of broadly, but I know specifically Universal Credit, you would file a mandatory reconsideration. Now, in terms of how you would do that, it can depend on the claim and what your access to the internet is and things like that. But generally speaking, you can file a mandatory reconsideration via the phone, via your Universal Credit Journal, via written form in a letter to the DWP. That would depend on your claim. If you have a telephone claim, obviously you'd be more comfortable ringing them up, but most people do like to file that on the journal as well, which they do allow you to do. So essentially you're explaining your reasons why you disagree with a decision of theirs and what you feel the correct decision should be, and you can provide evidence to that fact. I think the example I used before was, the wrong earnings being reported that has an effect on the payment. You can, challenge a decision about a, limited capability for work, or a work assessment. There's lots of different reasons why you would challenge it, but the main basis of it is that you will provide evidence to back up why you feel they're wrong. They would then review the decision and they would come back with what's called a mandatory reconsideration notice, which basically tells you, after reviewing their decision, what they've come to. Have they upheld their decision, or have they said, yeah, you're right, and we will change it to what it should be? Obviously, following on from that, and the important point to remember as well is this has to be within a month of when they make their actual verdict, which is important to know. So the quicker you file the mandatory reconsideration, the better. Sort of following on from that, if the DWP or Universal Credit do uphold their decision, you can go to sort of tribunal, and you can take it further. I would advise to probably get in touch with ourselves if you were struggling with that side of things. We do have benefits generalist and specialist advisors at the Citizens Advice who would be able to sort of look into your case and see what we can do to help on that. But I suppose, to summarise, there is a way to challenge it, and you would go via the mandatory reconsideration route.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's really good to know. I think what that sort of the month time frame that you have to challenge it is something that kind of is intriguing. So what I'm thinking of is people potentially who might have been sat on Universal Credit for months now, having had that initial award made and never thought to challenge it, never thought that they were able to, didn't necessarily recognise that there was something wrong. And that they may now be watching this and thinking, oh, hang on, something doesn't feel right here, and I want to have a look at whether or not it's correct. If that's the case, and so they haven't challenged and they haven't raised a concern within that month, does that mean that there's nothing more they can do, or would it just be that the process changes slightly?
Yeah, go on, Tom. I'll let you answer that. Go on.
No, it kind of depends. So it's really important to meet your deadline if you can. There is a 1 month deadline from the date of the decision to challenge it by asking for mandatory reconsideration. You can do so late, within 13 months of the original decision, if you have a very good reason why you weren't able to do so before then. Examples would include things like bereavement or having a disability or health condition so severe that it would have affected your capacity to challenge the decision before then. So ideally, you would meet the deadline if you're able to. If you've got a very good reason why you weren't able to do so before, you can put in a late mandatory reconsideration request. Now, technically speaking, there is a third option, which is called official error, which is essentially if the Department for Work and Pensions has made an official error about something such as the law, then you may be able to challenge it later than both the 1 month deadline and the 13-month deadline. But even for me as a generalist, that's something that I would probably end up suggesting that you get specialist advice to see whether you'd be able to make a challenge in that circumstance.
Fair enough. So I guess the really important point to make there is if you are even remotely concerned, check now and ask the questions now. Even if it turns out that actually everything's fine, it's better to check it sooner rather than later and get any queries in to challenge it if you are concerned.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that if you do sort of submit any evidence into your journal through like mandatory consideration, just screenshot it, because if your claim is ever closed, you won't have access to any of your journal anymore, so you won't have any proof that you have given them evidence. So just to be on the safe side, screenshot anything you sort of upload through your journal.
Yeah, that's really
I think.
good.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's a really good point.
I just wanted to add that I think that they work on the basis that when you fill in the claim and when you fill in your claim form, that you've insert, because it will ask you all these questions. Do you have children? Do you have housing costs? Do you have disabilities or health conditions and things like this? So they'd work on the basis that when you get your claim, if they don't hear from you from that point after you filled in the application form correctly, that you're happy with the claim, or maybe so that's why for people who may not notice they could be entitled to something 3 months later or 4 months later, they'll kind of work on the basis that you filled in the information on the form and they've given. So if they don't hear from you in that amount of time, that everything's okay in that sense, even if it could be an error on their part. So it is always best just basically to check your claim if you feel there's anything slightly not quite right about it or the amount just seemed too low. Yeah. So yeah.
I think that certainly sort of stands out, is this again, because as you were talking, Asya, about the sort of local housing allowance rates, and that maybe somebody might presume that, I'm getting a housing element, so they have taken that into account. They have taken into the fact that sort of my rent should be getting paid, but they might just not be getting quite the right amount.
Right amount, yeah.
For it. So I think it's just like, as you say, it's quite easy almost for people to miss those points, and it's maybe when they're coming to us for help because they're struggling to meet their rent that we then sort of go, well, yeah, obviously, because your universal credit award isn't correct. But I understand. I absolutely understand what you mean. Is that there will be, for the majority of people, that form will have been filled in with that correct information, and therefore, it is obviously there wouldn't necessarily be a reason to challenge it too late. Wonderful. So we've covered a lot of stuff there, I think, about universal credit and sort of kind of where there is potential for it to go wrong. So just sort of to wrap up, I think, so we haven't had any questions come in. I think we've had someone, I presume, directing a friend to pick up this at a later point, which is fantastic. Obviously, these recordings do stay on our Facebook page for people to pick up at another point. But is there anything else, guys, that you sort of feel you would want people to know about kind of picking up issues around their universal credit award before we close out today?
After you, Tom.
No, go on, Tom. I'll go on. I spoke last. Go on.
It's just a very quick one. So something that one of my colleagues is very, very passionate about being recognised at the moment is universal credit claims where you may not have an initial entitlement to universal credit, but you would have an entitlement if you were to be assessed as having limited capability for work, or if you were to be assessed as having limited capability for work and work-related activity. Those are slightly different, and I'll just give a very, very brief overview of that. So when you're assessed as having, for a work capability assessment, you can either be found fit for work, in which case, depending on the agreement that you made and your conditionality with universal credit, that's a whole other topic, you would be expected to look for work or more work if you're not working up to the amount of hours they expect you to work as part of your commitment. The second option is you can be found to have limited capability for work, in which case you don't get any extra money. You don't have to actively look for work, but you might be expected to take part in job preparation activities, work-focused interviews, that kind of thing. You get a work allowance applied, so there's an amount that you can earn up to before it starts to affect your universal credit. The third option is that you can be found to have limited capability for work and work-related activity. You get an extra it's 300 and something. I'd need to double check the figure. I think it's in the region of 360 per month on top of your universal credit amount. You get a work allowance applied. You're exempt from the benefits cap, which is a limit to how much can be paid to you in benefits total, and you won't have to look for work or prepare for work. Right. Because how much universal credit you get and whether you have an entitlement at all can be dependent on whether you are found to have limited capability for work and work-related activity or not. There are certain circumstances, for example, if somebody's under 25 and receiving statutory sick pay, where their earnings can be such that there is no entitlement to universal credit left over once their earnings have been subtracted from their universal credit award. I'm trying not to go over technical about it. But essentially, in those circumstances, you can still make a claim. And universal credit should still perform a work capability assessment if you inform them that you have limited capability for work and work-related activity. You can also ask them to pay you a penny on the claim and ask them to perform a work capability assessment as soon as possible. And they should look to arrange a work capability assessment from 3 days from when you tell them or submit a fit note to let them know that you have limited capability for work.
Great. So yeah, and as you say, it's even without going into the technicalities of it, that it's quite a lot to get your head around the kind of idea of a lot of those things. And again, you can see why people might miss the fact that there may be sort of entitlement or missed understanding there. So I think it is.
Yes. Sorry, I should stress, get in touch for advice if that applies to you.
Absolutely. So if you are sort of at all concerned or confused about that sort of element, please do give us a call. We will be able to sort of try and unpick what's going on there and help you to get anything that you might be entitled to. Other Tom, you were about to come in.
I just wanted to say very briefly just the importance of reporting change of circumstances with universal credit. And a change of circumstance may be anything from reduced hours or increased hours at work, people moving in and out of your property, whether you've moved into somebody's and now you're now living as a couple, whatever the case may be. The way I like to put it is any sort of change from your initial application form. It's just worth letting universal credit know, because there are instances where people have been overpaid universal credit. They've been paid too much money essentially by the DWP, and they may be forced to pay it back in future. And it may just be a case that they didn't know they had to report certain changes. So it's always, especially if you've got the online facilities as well, it's always worth just reporting that change via the journal, and that'll give a recorded log of the change being reported. And it's just to avoid any future debt or owing money to universal credit. But it's always worth knowing that, because I do deal with, there's a lot of instances where people have missed this and are now being charged. So it's just to let people know that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think particularly when we talk about, again, it's sort of, for me, the thing that would jump out is, I presume, where maybe their children pass a certain age, and that sort of changes their dependency level. Because obviously it's almost, sometimes it's more obvious to sort of report, I'm in work now, or I'm increased my hours, but that they might not think, now my child's over 16, that's changed my circumstances. But obviously,
absolutely. And it's just people may it does happen, you know. People may have a single claim. Somebody, you know, they move in with the partner, or the partner moves in and they keep their single claim, you know, whereas your partner's earnings would have to be taken into account now that they live with you. And there's all sorts of different scenarios, really. But the main thing to avoid any future trouble down the line, I suppose, is just to report any change in the Universal Credit Journal. Let them know. They can recalculate the claim accordingly, and it just absolves you of any wrongdoing, you know, for the future, or wrongdoing in their eyes, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as you say, it could go the other way as well. So, and potentially people sort of move in together and they don't report it. You might continue to get paid a single person rate.
Absolutely, you could miss out on money as well. So it kind of can work both ways. So yeah, just report. It can only work in your favour to report it, essentially.
Absolutely.
In the long run, yeah.
Great, thanks, Tom. And finally, Asia, is there anything you think we've missed, or have we covered everything?
I just think with the Universal Credit application, if you're a student sort of in postgraduate or sort of in that sort of, you know, higher education, there's not usually an option for you to put sort of a postgraduate loan when you're making your application. There's one for sort of simply a maintenance loan, but it doesn't take into account sort of discretionary loan or anything like that. But it is still important to tell Universal Credit about it, because again, it can result in an overpayment. Because with living expenses, they'll sort of subtract quite a lot of that from Universal Credit claim. If it's a postgraduate loan, it's only sort of 30%, but you do have to let them know of that, so you're not sort of, you know, given an overpayment letter essentially. But there's no option for that on your application, so you have to tell them sort of your work coach afterwards, or get in touch with them on the helpline to let them know.
That's great. Wonderful. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot within that 45-minute period. So thank you so much for your time today, folks. I think it's been really valuable to have you here. Just while I wrap up, I'm going to pop up our telephone number on the bottom of the screen again there. For you, if you do want to get in touch with us, if you've got any questions or queries at all about anything that we've talked about today, or of course about any other issues that you might need our support with, please do get in touch with us and our wonderful team, and they'll be more than happy to try and help you find a way forward. We will no doubt be back with another one of these live streams in a couple of weeks' time, talking about who knows what. We have yet to set the topic. If you've got any ideas, please do pop them in the comments, and we'd love to make sure that we're talking about things that are important to you. But I will leave you all to enjoy your evenings. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.